Hello there, everyone. This is Mr. Brass, and I'm here with Dr. J. Brian Huffling and Dr. James P. Sterba, and we're going to be having a little discussion on the problem of evil today. Now, Dr. J. Brian Huffling is a known Christian professor of philosophy and theology at the Southern Evangelical Seminary. He has a PhD in the philosophy of religion. He has taken courses in biblical studies and brings all his knowledge on the subjects to people. He's a defender of the classical view of God, and he can be reached at www.brianhuffling.com. Brian Huffling will tonight be defending a view held by philosophers Brian Davies and Ed Feser that speaks of God not as being a moral being. Now, Dr. James P. Sterba is a known atheist philosopher. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. He has a PhD in philosophy with interest in political philosophy and ethics. He has written numerous books and articles and has done some debates in the past on a variety of subjects. Dr. Sterba is going to be arguing that evil does pose a problem to Christian theism. This is a view held by numerous atheist philosophers like J.L. Mackie, Graham Oppie, Alex Rosenberg, Michael Tooley, and more. If you want to know more about Dr. Sterba's position, I recommend his book, Is a Good God Logically Possible? Anyway, now this will be done in a discussion format rather than a debate format. I highly doubt things will get out of hand and will require me to step in, but that is on the table. Dr. Huffling can go first and lay out his position, and Dr. Sterba can give his position afterwards and make some objections. From then, it will just be a straight up discussion, and at the end, I'll give both the speakers some questions that I gathered from people on Twitter. Brian, you can go first.
All right, how long do you want to go for?
We can go for an hour, hour and a half.
I mean, my own personal position.
Oh, well, I mean, you can go for as long as you want.
Okay, all right. So the position that I hold is not unique to me. I really cultivated my position out of the work of Brian Davies, who in turn cultivated his work out of, I think, Herbert McCabe and certainly Thomas Aquinas. Not all Thomists hold a position that we hold on this topic. In fact, not all Thomists agree on almost, there are a variety of things that we don't agree on. The nature of existence, for example, doctrine of analogy, all kind of fun stuff that we don't agree on. Some think God is a moral being, some think that he's not a moral being. The reason that it's interesting to talk about God's moral standing regarding the problem of evil is that most people, when they put the problem of evil together, but I don't think I've ever heard one put together where it doesn't say that God is good and has some kind of obligation or some kind of moral reasons or justification for allowing or disallowing evil. So, for example, Mackie, when he gives the standard kind of form of the problem, he says things like God is all-knowing, all-powerful, all good, and yet evil exists. You wouldn't think evil would exist if that kind of God exists. Therefore, that kind of God must not exist, kind of a paraphrase. And what's interesting is that most people really don't define the word good when they say God is all good or benevolent or whatever. Of course, the word good can have many different definitions. So I can pick anything out of my desk I have here. This little Marvin the Martian car my son gave me, a little Lego dog that he gave me, the pen. And I can say that this toy is good, my computer is good, the cheeseburger I had last night for dinner was good, a golf shot is good, or whatever. And so the word good really is tailored to or contracts to my word, to the referent in view. So to say that a steak is good is different than saying that my glasses are good. So my glasses are good if they are in good shape and help me see better. Okay, my car is good if it has everything it needs to run right and get me to where I want to go. But we know that X is good, whatever X stands for, based on the nature of X. So if I say plugorithmium is good, you'll say, well, okay, I don't know what that even means. Well, yeah, you don't know. That's a made up thing. So we can't know if it's good or not, or what it even means to be good. So when I say that a human being is good or not, or a car or a pair of shoes, we know what those things are supposed to be like. So when we say those things are good, we can say they're good or not based on what we know they're supposed to be and whether or not they actually are that way. And so applied to the problem of evil, when people say, well, God is good and wouldn't allow evil to happen, first, in the classical sense, we don't really have a knowledge of what God's nature is in and of himself. You know, the human essence is such that we know things through sensible experience. So you can know me through seeing me, hearing me, or whatever. I know my stuff around my desk, so I can see it. I can see people on the screen here. We can't see God. We can't feel or touch God. We, as classical theists, think that we can know about God's existence and some of what he's like and not like through creation. That's natural theology. Romans 1, for example, tells us we can know God through what's been made. So to say that God is good, we can say that, but we don't know exactly what the goodness of an infinite being is. However, to say that he's good in the moral sense, I think is wrong, because to be morally good, at least for a human being, means that you're acting in a way that you should behave or that you should act. And for God, in the classical sense anyway, God has no obligations or way that he, quote unquote, should act or behave, because he transcends it. So if we use the story of Job, for example, as an illustration, God, who was sovereign over all things and all life, allowed Satan to attack Job based on a dare, basically. In fact, Job, I think it's 2 verse 3, says that Satan incited God against Job without cause or without reason, in your translation. So God allowed Satan to attack him, to kill his family, destroy all that he had, and ultimately give him some kind of disease or sickness. If a human being did that, that person would be seen to be immoral by most people's counts, because we have an obligation not to intentionally allow people to die or cause them to die or cause them to get hurt. But in the classical sense, God transcends creation, as opposed to, say, pantheism or some limited view of God. Because he's the creator, he transcends all, like he transcends space and time. So God's not bound to space and time because he created it. He created beings like us that have a moral code based on the kind of things that we are. And so since he transcends that moral order, I think it's wrong for us to say that God has moral obligations. And so if we're going to phrase the problem of evil in such a way, to say that God is morally obligated to keep us from experiencing evil is the wrong way to cash out this discussion, because in my view, a la Davies and McCabe and Aquinas, God is not the kind of being to say he's supposed to do anything. Now, we can hash this out more. There are some distinctions that make this helpful, like the distinction about, well, did God have to create? No. Well, since he did create, and he created human beings, he created us with a certain nature and things that will help us flourish and be what we are. That's my position overall. We can flesh out whatever you want to flesh out as we go along. So that's it. That God being moral, and when Mackey says that the problem of evil, as he lays it out, is not an obvious contradiction until you start explaining these premises. And if you remove one of these premises, like God being wholly good, then the problem doesn't arise for you. That he says the exact thing. You say something like God's not wholly good, then the problem doesn't arise. Well, I'm going to say God's not wholly good in the way that Mackey means it. I think God is wholly good in the metaphysical sense that he's pure existence, in the classical kind of Augustinian Thomistic view of what it means to exist, and that existence and the notion of being and beauty and good are the same, but we think about them in different ways in the mind. So that's my overall position. I hope it makes sense. Feel free to ask me if I want to clarify anything for you, but that's my overall position.
All right, that's pretty good. Jim, you can give your position on the issue, and you can give some of your response to Brian.
Right. Well, let me start off by saying, I'm defending atheism here, but I've not always been an atheist. In fact, I was in a religious order for from age 14 to 26, and I only left after just before I would have had to take final vows. And even at that time, I was not an atheist. I actually only became an atheist very recently, after I was finishing my work in social political philosophy. The last published book, I said, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do now? I don't like I can continue this project anymore. It's kind of finished." But I had this idea of bringing ethics and political philosophy to bear on the problem of evil. And I went to the Templeton people. I said, are you interested in this? Now, if you know anything about the Templeton Foundation, John Templeton's idea, John Templeton thought that religion was kind of moribund and science was very active and progressive. And so his idea was, if you bring science and religion together, it's going to be good for religion. And so what I said was, look, I'm an expert in the science of ethics. I'll bring ethics together and to the problem of evil, and let's see if that doesn't create some good results. So I did that. They gave me money for a couple conferences and then time off, and I started on this project. And I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen. I brought these very distinguished philosophers in to talk about this question. And what I kind of noticed was that what I knew about ethics and political philosophy, the philosophers of religion weren't talking about that and how it applied to the problem of evil. They were coming at more as metaphysicians and logicians. And if they brought ethics in at all, they were kind of utilitarians, which was kind of strange because in traditional ethics, utilitarianism is a bad sort of view. And so I was thinking, what's going on here? Why are we not bringing these traditional ethics to bear on the problem of evil? And I kept working on that. And eventually I came to the conclusion that if you really bring ethics to bear on the problem of evil, it turns out that God is the God, a morally good God, is logically incompatible with all the evil in the world. Now, there's a little strange situation here because Brian may be willing to agree to that. So we're kind of agreeing that if God is thought of in a certain way as morally good, then all the evil in the world gets him in trouble, in big trouble, and such that you can't be this morally good God in the face of all this evil. So Brian's move is to say, wait a minute, there's another view here, maybe a traditional view, or at least one of the traditional views that says God is good, but not morally good. And once you make that move, then this problem can be solved. I mean, you don't have the argument against God. Now, most of my work has been dealing with philosophers of religion who accept the view that God is morally good, and it's been a battle with them. It's still going on in various ways. They really are the majority. Now I know about Davy's work. In fact, what happened was when I was starting this project, somebody, I can't remember the person now from Cambridge University, says, you got to look at Davy's work. And so, okay, I'll look at Davy. And and started looking at this, and I couldn't quite understand how it was moving. And I got myself invited up to Fordham to give a talk. Davy heard my talk, which was about how morally goodness gets God a problem. And he sort of kind of agreed with it. He said, but look, here's my view. And so we began back and forth, getting clear about his view. So I do have some knowledge of the kind of view. I think Brian is developing Davy's view. I don't think he's just repeating Davy's. He's done some interesting new moves to forward that view. But I do think I could have an argument against that view too. It's different from my argument against the view that God is morally good. And I guess the move that I would want to make is that once you say that you want God to be good, it's going to be very difficult to not conclude you want God to be morally good. Now, let me just concede something here. There's certain talk that we have about humans being morally good or humans being under obligations, morally required to do this and that. And in human contexts, being under an obligation is kind of like like something pulling on you, and you some of you pulls against it. Well, this kind of moral obligation couldn't be true of God. He couldn't be pulled in a bad way and a good way, and the good way sort of wins out. That's what happens in us. But that can't be the way obligation or morality works for God. He just would do and be inclined to do the morally good thing just right off the bat. That's the way. So right off, the language of moral goodness and moral obligation doesn't apply to God in exactly the way it applies to us. But that's true for every term we use of God. That's even true for the term being. It's analogy. We use this term. We use analogy. Where all the terms apply to God apply to God by analogy. And Brian brought that out in his own presentation there. They were using it by analogy. But analogy doesn't mean we're not making true claims. I mean, analogy is all through ordinary language. It's in scientific language. We make comparisons. Scientists make comparisons of the movements of electrons to the planetary system around the sun. Electrons around an atom to the planetary systems, and this is an analogy to explain how atoms are related, how electrons are related to atoms, the way the planets are related to the sun. So there's just analogy running through science, or running through ordinary language, and then running through religious language. We make true claims in those areas, even though we're talking analogously. Now, the question is, should we be talking about goodness in the sense of moral goodness, analogically to God, or is that kind of a prohibited notion? Well, I guess I have a problem here about how we're going to exclude talk of something like moral goodness. Well, Brian talks about God as being metaphysically good, and that's fine. Now, the issue would be, is God good with respect to his actions? Now, I think it's going to be really hard not to say God is good with respect to the way he acts. And I think what I mean, or what I think could understand to be meant by being morally good, is being good with respect to your actions, or maybe good overall with respect to your actions. And if we make that move, then we are in the position that whatever problems come out for moral goodness in God will come out even for Brian's view with respect to God.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Yeah, I definitely can see that when it comes to, when we're often speaking about actions, when it comes to even what humans do. So it would be sort of important to go over how that relates to God. And, so yeah, Brian, what would you have to say in response?
Yeah, so I think he's right. He said that every term that we use about God is analogous, and I think that's true. There's a lot of different views on how our language applies to God, even among the camps that I'm in. So some Thomists hold that, for example, when I say God is good and man is good, that the definition is the same, or the concept, and then it's just applied to the man finitely and applied to God infinitely, and that's sometimes called analogy. I think that's more along the lines of Scotus, though, where you have the term being univocal. And I actually don't see the predication of that being analogous. It's just more, which is really just sort of univocation. And then there's those of us who follow in the camp in Thomism, like Gregory Roca, for example, who wrote a book called "Speaking of the Incomprehensible God." It's a really good book. It's a dense book. It says even the concepts themselves are analogous. That's why I said, if I look at my phone or my computer or my pen or my meal, to say that those things are good, you can use any term you want to, but the phone is good, the stereo is good, the desk is good. The notion or concept of goodness here, even regarding finite things. So my phone is good in a different way than, say, I'm good, or a different way than my speakers on my desk are good. So I think that it can be demonstrated that we use terms, even of finite things, analogously, where the concept themselves does not have the exact same definition. But to say that, Well, good for a phone is tied up to what it means to be a phone. So a good phone, a phone is good if it's what it's supposed to be. Same thing for a pen or a steak or whatever, or a person. And so if the concepts are analogous with these finite things, then we should expect them to be no less analogous when it comes to God. So if we, in Christian theology, for example, even theistic theology, it's really, really difficult to explain not only what a soul is, but also what an angel is. And both are immaterial and they're finite and they're caused by God in our views. And it's really hard to explain what, say, an angel is. We say it's immaterial, it's not spatial, it's not really temporal, and it can affect changes in various ways. It's hard to explain what an angel really is. So then how much more is it going to be hard to explain what God is, who is not even finite, not created, has an infinite, limitless amount of existence and being. So I think Jim's right in saying that all these terms that can be used about God analogously, because if we say that anything else, we're kind of reducing God to a man. So when I had a panel discussion with a Christian philosopher a couple years ago, and he said, well, the difference between God's knowledge and our knowledge or power really is in degree, not in kind. So we can even take the word knowledge, and I would take issue with that and say that, well, for what it means for God to know has to be different than what it means for me to know, because I know passively through my senses, and God knows, and again through my tradition, actively and causally, because he's causing all things to exist. He's not learning. An infinite being can't learn, and he would be infinite. He'd be passible and all that. So even in terms of like knowledge or power, these things, I think Jim's right that we can take all these terms in the same way as good to be analogous with God. I think that's right, and that's what a lot of us in Thomism do. He said that an analogy doesn't mean that we're not speaking truth, and that's exactly right. Analogy would be worthless if there's no truth in it somehow. It's just, we're not saying that God is literally X. When I say God is X, powerful, just, merciful, knowledgeable, good, whatever, we're saying all those things. We're just not saying them in the exact same way that we mean them for ourselves. Because to say that God is in the same way as man is or anything created would mean that God is really no more than a creation, or just quantitatively greater or more. And some hold to that view. And I think that just makes God too much of a being and blurs the creator-creature distinction. And when you said, is God good with respect to his actions, I guess you meant moral good. Jim, is that right? Is he morally good?
I mean, do you want to say all that God is good with respect to his actions or not?
Even in a moral sense?
Drop any adjective there. Is there some sense God is good with respect to his actions on your view or not?
Okay. I guess it would depend on what's meant by good. So on the classical view of God being simple, not having parts, and being a se, not depending on anything else, his goodness doesn't depend on what he does, like a human being would be. So I'm good or bad depending on what I do. So we're not adding anything to God's goodness by saying he did this or not. So is it good that God created? Yes, it doesn't add anything to his goodness. It added being and goodness to the created order, but God got, and if you take a strong sense of impassibility and aseity, there's a real sense in which God doesn't get anything out of that because he's already perfect and infinitely blessed and doesn't need anything. So depending on what's meant there, I would say, yeah, maybe depending on which is what's meant there. His action being good, though, this is where I went back earlier and said that we can make a distinction in God being absolutely doing something absolutely necessary or by supposition. So God did not have to create. He was not any kind of obligation to create. But supposing he did, he said, I'm going to make human beings. Well, once he willed, not temporally, but once he willed to make human beings and everything, he can't then will that something like rape or murder is a good thing, because that harms the nature of a human being. So it's not like a utilitarian sense, like you mentioned a little bit ago about utilitarianism. So we think that there's an objective, real essence to what it means to be human. And so once God creates a human being or decides to create humans, he cannot then say, okay, I'm going to will that attacking or being violent, another one human against another human being violent is a good thing. Because to be good in this kind of Thomistic Aristotelian notion of good for humans is that something is good if it promotes the nature of what it's supposed to be. Of course, stealing, killing, raping, all that is detrimental and harmful. So those things wouldn't be good. So yeah, so God's actions are good, not in the sense that he gets anything out of them, and he's not necessarily having to create, but once he does create, what he has will to create has to be of a certain way, and nothing can go against that in the creator. If I'm hearing you right and I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, let's go with that a little bit.
I mean,
Okay.
if I may add one thing, just so to clear up to maybe the audience and maybe even to Jim here, your view is like the ethical theory that you're proposing is more of akin to natural law theory. Is that correct?
What I'm proposing in terms of human morality and human goodness, yes, because to be a good human means that you're promoting the well-being of what it means to be a human. So, for example, cutting someone's arm off, depriving them of food, raping, stealing, all that kind of stuff would be harming the person, which is, depending on how it's viewed, either or how it's done, either a moral evil or some kind of physical evil. Yeah, so it's in a natural law view where there's an objective nature of what it means to be a human, and it's not based on any kind of relativistic notion. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And another thing is that many people might go into, but also wouldn't the intent also be a factor in something as well? Like, for example, let's say we're hiking up a mountain, and let's say we're just stuck there, and your arm has gotten frostbite and stuff. Well, if I cut your arm off, you could say in a sense that, well, I'm depriving you of your arm.
Yeah.
But you would say that would be a good thing that I'm doing in the sense because my intent is not to deprive you of that function. So would you say, because, we're talking about actions a lot, but I think intent also plays a factor.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the intent there would not be simply to cut the arm off and saying, oh, I'm going to cut your arm off because I want to. This would be probably in the vein of the principle of double effect, where I'm going to cut your arm off so that I can save your overall person and being. That would be, this happens in surgery all the time. All right. Someone has some kind of problem with the limb and they're going to die if they don't cut it off. Well, cutting it off is, in a sense, is a physical evil in the sense of losing that being and what you're supposed to be is kind of a physical evil, not a moral evil in a sense. But it has a higher good in view. So yeah, it would be an action with a good intention, with a result that results in somewhat of an evil aspect to it for a greater good, not in a utilitarian sense, but for the own person's nature.
All right.
To promote that overall goodness.
Let's go back to God's actions. Again, for the focus.
I was making sure to clarify so everyone knows and
Yeah.
knows.
Sure. So if we go back to God's actions, and so God's creation is primary action of God. We probably want to say creation was good. Okay, so there's God acting, and we want to say the act was good. So we do want to say goodness applies to God's actions. Now creation is not the only thing that God does here.
Okay.
One of the things he does is also permits evil in the world, because if he didn't permit evil, there wouldn't be evil. And so that's another action of God. Now the question is that action good? And that already, once we raise that question, we're good. We're not good overall. We're doing what I would call a moral evaluation of God with respect to his actions.
Yeah, so I see you giving a moral evaluation here. So in the Thomistic view, this is why some Thomists don't like the free will defense that Planting offers. The free will defense, just as those who don't know, that that God might not have been logically able to create a good world without the possibility of evil. In the Thomistic sense, though, God does not just create people and then kind of hands off laissez faire, they're going to go do their own thing. But God is upholding every person in what they do.
Right.
So God is upholding the murderer as he's murdering.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right,
So
right.
a distinction.
Is
Go ahead.
that justified? The question is, part of the upholding is to permitting the murderer to commit his horrendous deed. And,
Right.
and that is an action of God's. And then the question is, look, if it was a question of an action of us, we'd say, you can't do that.
Right.
You know, you can prevent it and you're not doing it, you're morally in trouble.
Right.
Now, it seems like an analogous problem is here for God. He prevented, he doesn't. Maybe there's a justification, but that's what we have to pursue. There is an action here that is a little bit questionable by analogy to human actions. And then if it's not going to be questionable for God, we need some kind of explanation. And that's now we're doing moral evaluation.
That's right. That's how most people, atheists and theists, go about the problem of evil. We're saying, okay, well, are there morally justifiable reasons for God allowing all these horrible things going on? Yeah. That's typically how the both the defensive and the theodicies go. So a defense, is saying God can logically exist, even if we don't know how. We can give these reasons for it. Here's how we can at least explain how he might exist. And the theodicy is saying, here's why he lets it happen. What I'm trying to do, and what I'm interested in this is really trying to focus on the theist and say, look, and trying to say that we're justifying God. In justifying God, we're putting some kind of a standard above God in order to say that he's justified because of that standard. It's the case of that, in our view, that God, because he's transcendent of all things and that he's sovereign over all creation, that he is created and can do with his creation as he sees fit. This is why Job isn't right and willing to bring God into court and call him unjust. Because God, it's interesting, God doesn't give a theodicy. If there's ever a place in the Bible for God to give a theodicy, here's why I did this. Here's all my morally justifiable reasons. Here's what I think. At the end, God just says, you weren't here. You don't know what you're talking about. So shut up, Job. That's what God ends up saying. So to say that, I think it's fine to ask the question, well, what does it mean for God to allow the murderer to murder? What does that mean for him? But then once we start saying, is he justified? Well, justified according to what? Because in order to say God is justified means there's got to be something that we're judging God against. Well, it couldn't be creation because God is Lord over all creation. So there's going to be something, quote unquote, outside or external from creation. And I don't know what that would be.
That's a good move.
Okay.
Now the question is it true that God is not subject to any standards? Let's think about that a little bit. I mean, one possibility is think about the standards of arithmetic. Can God make 2 + 2 = 5?
No.
That's something just even God do. He's subject to the axioms of arithmetic and maybe even the axioms of logic. So if he's subject to the axioms of arithmetic and the axioms of logic, maybe he's subject to the axioms of morality, that there's some necessary truths of morality. And just like God is, this idea, maybe he's subject to axioms of arithmetic and axioms of logic, he would be subject to the axioms of morality. And go back to the Job case. I know there is actually a move you make here, Brian. This is astonishing to me in a way because it's a move that is made by Richard Swinburne. And we know Richard Swinburne is in this camp of there's this objective morality that God is supposed to be abiding by, and yet he will make why? How is it an analogous move? Well, see, you do something like, well, God could take our lives away from us. because maybe he gave us our lives, and so he's not doing anything wrong. But notice what's happening there. There's a standard of morality. Don't take lives, maybe unless you've given that life, something like,
Right.
and then you do have a right to take the life. So there's a sense in which the moves you make in the Job cases and other cases, you're saying that there's a morality, and this is what Swinburne wants to do. There's a morality, objective morality applies to God and us, but God's got, well, he wants to say, because he's a super benefactor, he can permit evil when we can't. And so now, whether that works or not, I don't think that quite works. But what's interesting is he has God and us subject to the same morality, and God sort of can do things we can't because of other factors about, well, that God was this benefactor, and maybe because of what he will be able to accomplish by permitting the evil. And so, but we can't have that kind of justification. But the morality is the same for God and ourselves.
Yeah, so I agree with you first said 2 + 2 = 5, and God can't make that otherwise, and that God can't, quote unquote, go against logic. Yeah, I agree with that, because 2 + 2 = 5 and the laws of logic, there's certain things that just can't be done in and of themselves. Like God can't create a square circle, because the thing in and of itself is an impossibility. So it's not a lack of God's power, it's the thing in and of itself can't be done. So to apply that to morality, I think we have to show that there's got to be some kind of contradiction with God doing something. So there's a contradiction in a square circle or 2 + 2 = 5. I'm not sure what the contradiction would be in the moral statement. And I also agree with you. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, if I, from what I'm getting from here, the idea that there is sort of an axiom to morality does harken me back to the idea of maybe morality being a brute fact in some sense.
Well,
where
no more than logic is a brute fact. I mean, there's, brute fact usually talks about empirical things, whereas, a fundamental axiom of logic or an axiom of mathematics wouldn't probably be called a brute fact.
Yeah, I mean, because that's what I sort of get from it, because, well, I mean, guys like Ed Fazer do make a distinction between sort of a contingent brute fact and a metaphysical brute fact. A contingent brute fact would be, let's say your house is set on fire. The firefighters come to your house. They do a thorough investigation, and they can't find an explanation for why your house was set on fire. So a contingent brute fact would be more or less that, well, there's simply no explanation for why your house is on fire because we've done the most thorough investigation and we can't find it. Whereas a metaphysical brute fact goes a step above that, where it says it's not just that we at the moment can't find, the answer to why your house is burned down. It would be that in principle, it's not explainable.
Well, yeah, but I think we can find these things in morality that are not quite like what you're talking about. One way, let me come at it 2 ways. One way is to talk about something would be just intrinsically wrong. Torturing an innocent baby for the fun of it, or an innocent child for the fun of it. There's no way. It's logically impossible that that's justified. Okay. Now, another way to put it is, suppose you can achieve certain goods without permitting horrendous evil. It's very easy for you to do. Then permitting the horrendous evil to get the goods when you could easily not permit the horrendous evil and get the goods. That would be just immoral to do. So anybody that did that would be being immoral. And the truth there is a logical truth about morality, just as the truth about torturing a baby, a child for the fun of it. It's a truth about morality that can't be right. There's no way that can be morally right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
If I may if I may give a little example of what I think you're talking about, it would be sort of like the case of an arsonist firefighter, where with a hero complex, where basically you have this firefighter that just goes around and sets fire to buildings just so he can come and put them out. Because he wants to be known as the guy that saves people. Well, he didn't have to cause that evil in order to save people. He could have just, waited until a fire naturally happened and saved people.
That would be a pretty bad thing. Yes, I'm not quite sure. I'm sure how it probably either it's one of the moral axioms or it's pretty close to one, but I'm not sure whether. I'll go with that. Certainly looks bad to me.
Yeah, that's what I was sort of getting from it. It would be sort of like the case of an arsonist firefighter where they set fire to buildings just for the sake of, they want to be known as the person that saves people, but they didn't have to set fire to buildings in order to save people. So while they may have done some good by saving people, it was unnecessary.
Yeah, you have the possibilities of saving people in other contexts. Yeah. And
Yeah.
My general principle was you could always just imagine in general, the goods were available and you chose to get the good by permitting the evil when you could easily get the good without permitting the evil. That would just by the principle of it has to be morally wrong. Now, those are the kinds of axioms that I think God also is subject to, just like he can't go against make 2 + 2 = 5. He's subject to laws of axioms of arithmetic. And so this is a moral maxim God is subject to. And the problem that I see then is God violates these very fundamental moral maxims quite regularly. If he existed,
right.
I wonder violating them quite regularly.
I wonder if we're seeing morality in a different way, because you seem to reduce morality or tie it to logic, where, and even we would say that logic and math are ultimately grounded in being, and that morality itself is also grounded in being. So if a lion kills a human being to eat it, we wouldn't call that a moral problem. But if a human being kills another human being to kill it, that would be a moral problem because of the kind of thing it is. So this is the kind of moral code that is based in being in existence. So I'm wondering, do you see morality based? You seem to say it's more based in axioms, whereas we would say in the more natural law camp that it's based in the nature of existence of a thing. So do you see it more in a logical framework or more in the metaphysical framework?
Well, you couldn't have any moral wrongs unless you had intelligent beings capable, back to the intention,
Right.
capable of having intentions and envisioning actions and consequences. So snakes are not moral beings.
I'll differ. I would say they're very evil. I don't like listening at all.
You've been influenced by the Adam and Eve story.
That's right.
Anyway, so there's lot the moral maxioms only apply to certain kinds of beings if they happen to exist. So you can imagine these moral maxims, just like the rules of logic. I mean, if there is no creation, these maxims, in some sense, are still true, and the moral rules would be somewhat are still true. It would just be if there was a rational creature who could abide by these rules, intentionally understand them, and abide by them, then they would apply to those rules would be applying to that person. And it's so they have this sort of they can exist. These rules can exist even if there's no creatures who could.
Am I right in assuming that you hold? I guess you have to hold some kind of naturalistic evolution to account for human life.
Yeah, there's an evolutionary process there.
Okay.
Human life was kind of, in a sense, a bit of an accident.
Right.
At least as far as we can see, because if that asteroid hadn't struck the Earth and killed off the dinosaurs, our ancestors, the little mammals who were creeping around, trying to keep away from the feet of the dinosaurs, would have never been able to develop and we would have never developed. So,
Yeah.
we kind of have this accidental cause that brings, it's at least what we know about our Earth here, that brings us into existence. But then there's an evolutionary process. Darwin tells us about how that goes. And so what happened is we've evolved to have a certain intentional capacities and understandings, and language is big crucial thing here, development of language to be able to think morally. So we have evolved this way, and we could de-evolve. We could, as global warming comes on and it becomes more difficult for us to think, who knows what's going to happen to the human race in very hot environments. There has never been humans, I think, in as hot an environment as we are right now, and we're getting hotter. What this is going to mean for the development of the human race, I won't know, but somebody will know. Yeah.
Well, the reason I asked that is because there's a debate among both naturalists and theists about the relationship between evolution and morality, and some think it's some naturalists will actually say that we don't have any objective morality because there's nothing transcendent over us. It's just that if you hold more to a more survival of the fittest kind of view, if that's even your view, might not be your view, that what would be objectively there in place to make it where that acting towards somebody, because you don't seem to like the utilitarian framework, then what is it that gives the objective notion of morality to be able to say that for the accidental human race to be here, that it's objectively good for them to act in certain moral ways?
Well, yeah, I know that a lot of atheists do take almost a subjectivist line here, and say that morality is a product of evolution. I don't.
Okay.
In fact, before I even took my atheist turn, for 25, 30 years, I was developing an objective morality, and in political morality, social morality, and applying it to a whole range of topics. And I was at an institution, I am an institution, which has this view that faith and reason do not conflict. So I was working out this view about what reason requires, and I was working out an objective morality. Now, at the time, I didn't have it exactly, I knew I didn't want to found this morality on God, because a lot of theists don't want to found the morality on God. They worried about things like divine command theory, and they don't want a divine command theory. So I could see that there was a way to sort of have an objective ethics. It's not a product of evolution, although the fact that we evolved, that these objective norms can apply to us, there was a coincidence there. If we hadn't evolved the way we had, then we wouldn't have been moral beings, and we may de-evolve and become not moral beings. So it's and maybe other beings will evolve into be moral beings, and so it all depends. But the moral norms depend on ability to form intentions, to assess consequences, and then what, and then what you're talking about interests of things, what's good for things. And now this is where natures come in to determine what's good for the things. And then morality works over that domain of natures. I mean, for me, the most fundamental moral requirement is to treat fairly all the relevant interests. That's the most fundamental. Now, that's a moral requirement. I actually take this a little bit higher, because people want to say, well, why be moral? Why don't I be an egoist? And so I also have a fundamental rational requirement. And the fundamental rational requirement gives us the fundamental moral requirement, and the fundamental moral requirement gets the secondary moral requirements, and back down to practice. So, my last book before when I finally started work on the problem of evil was From Rationality to Equality. So it was from a non-moral notion of rationality binding on all rational beings, and then ultimately getting all the way to almost a socialist morality. That was the deduction of the book. A lot of people want to get off at certain places there, but that was the move to make, and I had all that in place before I came to deal with the problem of evil.
So would those axioms be there if the beings were not there? My reason I ask that because it seemed like if you don't have the beings, would there be any of those axioms? And if not, wouldn't the beings take precedent ontologically over those axioms, or how do you see that?
No, I'm not quite sure about this, but
Okay.
the idea is something like if there was no creation and no God, would 2 + 2 still equal 4? I think so.
Yeah.
And if that's true, I think there could be an analogous moral maxim that nobody's going to know about. And nobody's going to know about 3 + 2 = 4 either. There's no beings in existence. But those things are not dependent on, maybe back to the brute facts of what exists and what doesn't exist.
Mhm.
They're just there. I mean, it's always funny how the number 1 exists. What is it? How does the number 1 exist? It doesn't exist anything. It's a very unusual notion of existence here, but I think it's a notion of existence that will in some sense it's there, even if all the other things we talk about as existing things weren't there.
So you see 2 + 2 = 4 as having some kind of an ontological existence, like in an abstract object kind of thing?
In where?
As an abstract object?
It's an abstract. They are abstract objects.
Okay.
And abstract objects seem to exist. They're not created.
Right. See, I was trying to understand your view of that because on our end of the view, all what we know about math and even logic are rooted and grounded in being and existence. And so we would argue that when the theists are all over the place with this thing, but would argue that these abstract objects like numbers or necessary truths are grounded in being. Like God ultimately is being. So I was trying to understand where you came from with that.
But go back to this though. Now let's run this back a little bit. Suppose now, I don't know what you want to do about the math on this, but so suppose there's no God.
Okay.
Would there still things be morally wrong for us to do to other humans or not?
Well, I'm not trying to sidetrack your question, but I mean, it's hard to imagine, from my view, there being anything if there's no God, because God is the sole grounding for everything else's existence. I'm not sure how to answer that, because that to me is almost a metaphysical contradiction.
Well,
I don't know.
I mean, it just seems. It seems to me that think about it. Another way to come at this is that there's different views on this, but one view of this is that atheists don't need to believe in God to be moral.
Right.
Okay, so now how is that supposed to work? So somehow they can ascertain what are moral requirements and abide by them, even if they don't believe in God. But now, if you would say, wait a minute, William Craig will say, yeah, he'll go for that. But they said, but then they want to say maybe, but the grounding for the moral requirements is God. And maybe that's parallel to what you're saying. But see, what I want to say is, well, is the grounding for 2 + 2 = 4 God? What's the sense he's grounding it? Could he make it not the case? No. Well, then what is it? What's the sense he's grounding it? I think there's a sense in which it looks like that's independent of anything that exists in a more, the way God and we would exist. It just, there are different things, and these abstract truths for logic, for math, and maybe for morality would just be there and be true, even if nothing else existed.
Okay. Yeah, and I would differ from people like Bill on the grounding of morality, because people like Bill in our circles want to say that God is our grounding in morality. We're moral if we're living up to him and what he is, because they take God as a moral being. Even though Bill says God doesn't have moral obligations, we're supposed to be good like God is. For those like Aristotle and Aquinas, though, in our camp would say, well, God has made the human essence to be a certain way, and a human is good if he lives up to that essence, not living up to a reflection of God.
Yeah.
I mean,
yes.
from what I gained from what Jim was saying is that it's sort of like the difference between epistemology and ontology, where someone could, like we had beliefs about light before science even came about.
Right.
But there was, we had, beliefs and we knew certain things about light, but it wasn't until science that we came to like what's the grounding of light, where light comes from and stuff like that. So I think that's sort of where it would go in the distinction between epistemology and ontology, where, atheists could know, that, let's say, torturing babies for fun is wrong. Craig would just argue that they just would not have a grounding for it.
But see, now what are you going to say there? Are you going to say it's because God commanded that torturing not be done to babies? And that's why it's wrong? Commanded it? I think that's a really big problematic.
I do too.
Yeah. So now what's the grounding here? What does it do? If it does, we understand how commands, but actually we don't fully understand it, because when commands just can't command, you can't make anything right by commands.
Right.
I mean, if you think about commands, even legitimate commands work within a framework. And we can make rules of the road in the United States and rules of the road in the UK, and we make them differently. But that was because of laws issued, and so there was a framework, and we couldn't make rules of the road that drive recklessly as much as you can. I mean, this would be there's a limit on what the rules can be and what the commands can be.
Right.
So now once you've got that in place, what's the sense in which God grounds morality? Well, I don't see that God grounds mathematics or logic, and I think I don't see he's any way needed to ground morality. Now, if he was saying, well, he's needed to ground mathematics and logic, well, how? And I don't see where you're going to go with this. There've been much more. It's been easier to try to go at morality and sort of say, well, it's you could see how God could because we see how relative cultural relatively practice morality is. So it looks like there's variation there. So it looks like we could say, well, maybe it is something that God could ground. But if you really work in objective ethics, you'll go against this moral relativism, and so you don't have to worry about it anymore. You've got an answer to moral relativists. You've got an objective ethics. And I don't see why you would want to say that God has to ground. But see, now the point is, if I isolated the norms of there's some fundamental norms of ethics here, and then we want to say, okay, and God is good with respect to his actions. Now, even if we want to, let's just go, even if God grounds the norms, why is he not also then bound by them?
Well, he would be in the sense of, in this distinction between absolute and suppositional necessity, that where God is not under any consternation to create, but once he wills to create a human being, he can't then will to say, as you said, that torturing babies is a good thing, because then torturing a baby would be harming the baby. So God, we would say God is the grounding of all that because of his creative will and act. That once he wills to create that, and he wants to make these certain objective natures, then only certain kinds of actions can promote the good or prohibit the good of those kind of natures.
Yeah,
that's good.
I think this gets into the notion of the Euthyphro dilemma.
Yeah. Well, we're actually, Brian and I kind of agree on this. We don't, neither of us want divine command theory. We're trying to see if there's another kind of grounding here that isn't like the divine command. So the Euthyphro thing really does knock out, I think we both think, knock out the divine command theory as normally understood here. So that's common ground between us. The question is there's this other kind of grounding. Now, I think you're right that there is something about our natures that if we were made certain ways, some things would be right. If we made certain ways, other things would be right. I also get this example of, suppose God changed our nature such that Brian takes a knife and plunges it into my chest, and I die and immediately spring back to life with terrific pleasure. Now we got a new rule. Put knives in people's chest as often as possible, because we changed the nature. But see, I think that's a way in which creation of different kinds of beings could make certain things right and wrong in different ways. But there is still a more fundamental thing about never do evil for the fun of it.
I agree.
Enjoyment. That holds for all creation, all possible creations. And so there's some norms that we have to plug natures in to get the requirements, but there's some even more fundamental norms that would be treat fairly all over an interest. That applies to all possible creations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to disagree on anything in our ethics. It's interesting. You said that this would be dependent on the thing's nature. Does that align with your view that there are logical axioms that are necessary eternal? Because you seem to say that they're based on the nature.
The moral maxioms are actually above human nature.
Right.
So they're not, and that's why I said, human nature could be different, and then different axioms and then axioms would apply differently.
But there would always be some kind of axiom for every kind of nature.
No, there would be the ultimate axioms, and then there would be secondary axioms for different natures coming out of those ultimate axioms.
Okay.
Yeah. I remember, earlier on, Brian got into the story of Job. Now, in the story of Cain and Abel, there was this situation where Cain kills Abel, and then, immediately after, God says, "Hey, where's Abel?" And saying, ask him, "Well, wait, what did you do?" And, and Cain says basically, "Well, you never," like paraphrasing, he says, "Well, you never told me I couldn't kill Abel."
Well, I didn't get that. I thought what was happening was Cain was a little upset because God seemed to be approving of Abel's sacrifice and not his.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of jealousy that he was motivation for. And I forgot. He said, "Well, where is Abel?" He said, "I'm not my brother's keeper." And of course, why would God be asking where is Abel? He knew what happened. You suppose he knew what happened to Abel. It's a little unclear how to run this story. This is part of the way that some biblical scholars say that the earlier understanding of God in the Bible was not clearly what we have now when we talk about the God of the philosophers or anything. It was maybe he was a little more anthropomorphic. And maybe to be in the image of God was to be in the image of this kind of super human-like being who walks in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. And we take these are metaphors now, really strong metaphors. But maybe the earlier writers were not thinking that metaphorically. There was some difference between God and humans, but he was more human-like than it later became as the tradition develops. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not a biblical scholar. I find that all fascinating because I used to teach biblical history in high school for a while, and I always found that fascinating. So, when I was just teaching it, that all this biblical interpretation, going back and doing scholarship on the early peoples, that were all this was just beginning to be opened up in Catholicism. Before that, you don't even read the Bible. You listen to what the priest tells you is in the Bible, But now there was this whole movement, and it was all fascinating. But it's kind of continued, and now Brian, we'll go with this. I'm sure some are telling us that Moses was probably not a historical figure, and the patriarchs were not historical figures. That they were, and the Exodus probably never really occurred. the Jews, when they got to Palestine, they've been looking for signs for, a large group of people roaming around in the desert for 40 years. And they haven't found any signs of that. That's pretty hard to hide such a large group of people for 40 years and no evidence of them in any of the areas that would be promising for where they were roaming before they got into Palestine. So there's some argument here that there's very interesting stories about it. Now you can make a big metaphor out of it, and you still got God, but exactly how much of it is historical and how much of it is a belief about God having chosen the Jews and He is their people and He will help them somehow in the future.
Yeah.
How much of it is? How much of we take is, well, that's what really could have happened, and we could believe that. But all the other is more of a way to figure it all out, to set it all out.
Yeah, I brought up the Cain and Abel story, so because in order to re-emphasize where I think you and Brian both agree is like, because Cain basically says, well, I'm not my brother's keeper, and basically you didn't say I couldn't kill my brother, so I think in a way that you would.
Oh, I see where you were going with that. Now I see what you were doing. Okay.
Yeah, so it would seem to go that you would both agree that obviously, well, even in the biblical narratives, that where obviously God doesn't have to command something in order for him to expect, his creations to know what's right. So that's why I mainly brought it up.
You want to do another one there, because the whole idea of commanding that a fruit not be eaten seems to be the wrong sort of thing to make so much count on that. That seems, maybe it's a big metaphor, but in any realistic setting, take a child, don't eat that piece of candy or something, and then they do, and then what do? Throw them out of the house? I mean, you just don't do. This is not the kind of offense, the kind of thing that can be made a big offense. So, I actually think the Cain and Abel story could have been made a big offense there. There was certainly a big offense there, but the Adam and Eve story, at least on the rating, there's no justification for making failure, disobedience there on such a trivial matter, so consequential.
Yeah, that was sort of my reason I wanted to tie it to what you both sort of believe. So anyway, I think what are some, I'm trying to think how to word it. Oh yeah, so you both tend to agree on some basic things, like you believe like natures are very important when it comes to evaluating morality, and I think while Brian does take the sort of God not being at least moral in the sense that me and you would be moral, I think I would like to hear more about how Brian would square God actions, intent, and the like.
Okay, so clarify that question. How I can explain how an atheist can be moral, or what do you mean?
Well, I mean, you could go into that, like how could an atheist be moral and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would just say, I think like you made the distinction before about epistemology and ontology. So a person doesn't have to believe in God to be moral. He just has to go along with what it means to be human, and to be a good human to be moral in that sense. Now, of course, in the ultimate sense of good, in the theological sense of being good because of original sin, no one can be good on their own. But to be good in the normal everyday sense, an atheist can be perfectly good. I know atheists who are more, I think, are at least as good, if not morally better than some Christians, I think, like myself included, probably. And it's because we have this nature, and it doesn't matter if you believe in the cause, you still have the nature, so you can still do what is good or bad according to your nature and other people's natures around you. Am I getting at your question? I'm not sure if I'm quite getting at what you're wanting me to answer.
That works for at least what I was asking.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I could agree with a lot of that. But I think what happens here is that the question is how morality is elicited out of our nature. I think what happens is we have a nature that's able to think about norms and how people should behave and how interests should be taken into account. So we have that, and that's a capability that had to evolve, had to be there. Once it's there, and then we could figure out for ourselves what is harmful, what's beneficial, and then we could figure out how the norms will be given the harms and benefits that we see our natures are capable of. But then the way we're doing this is we're actually coming up with norms that are actually above our natures. That's why I say if our nature changed, we already know. When I did my thing about putting a knife in the person's chest, we already know what the norm is going to be. We don't have to consult God. What do you think, God? We know that now putting a knife in a person's chest will be a great thing because our natures have changed. So the way we're getting it out of our natures is we're able to reflect on our natures, what's good for us and what's bad for us, and for other things too, because part of morality can be a relationship to non-human living things, and I think it applies there, and we have constraints on what we can do to them, given our morality. But what we're learning is something analogous to learning mathematics or the rules of mathematics. Then we can apply it when we're counting jelly beans or something. But we know it at another level, at least, or maybe the jelly bean count got us to the ultimate principles. We're able to conceive of them, and now we could apply it to lots of different things, even things that don't exist, and we can imagine what the results would be there. So it's coming out of nature. Nature is the stimulus and the condition for us recognizing these norms that apply to all things that have interests.
Yeah, I mean, so, we did talk about sort of a bit of Brian's, his ethical framework that he goes into arguing. From what I've gathered from you, you seem to, since I don't take you to be a utilitarian, obviously. Would you say your position leans more heavily on, say, deontology?
Here's the way I think about it. I think there are deontological constraints on consequences. When I come to God, this has to work a little differently, because I don't want my requirements that God is not abiding by to be just deontological requirements and not consequentialist ones. Because we also know that sometimes, even the ontologists should know, that sometimes consequences could outweigh the deontological requirements. So the way I formulated the moral principles that I think God is in constant violation of, there are moral principles that hold under consequentialism and under deontology. And I think that I actually wrote an ethics book that tried to work this out in terms of talking. See, we normally talk about Kantian ethics, utilitarian ethics, Aristotelian ethics, or in political philosophy, we talk about liberalism or libertarianism, welfare liberalism, socialism. What I wanted to do, but those are not exclusive classifications. It could be another ism, well, I wanted to have an exclusive classification, and consequentialism, non-consequentialism is the way to go. Everything's got to be either consequentialism or non-consequentialism. And then, so what I claim is that there's certain moral requirements that hold under consequentialism and under deontology, and under non-consequentialism. And those are the ones that God is violating. Now, for us, there'll be we can't get that coincidence of all the things that are binding on us or hold under consequentialism, non-consequential. Sometimes there'll be the issues where consequentialism should take precedence over deontology or non-consequential, and sometimes there'll be, for us, conditions under which non-consequentialism should take precedence over consequentialism. But the norms that I want for God here, and they also apply to us, are norms that hold under both consequentialism and non-consequentialism.
Mm-hmm. I think what any framework of, like, no matter whether you are a deontologist or a virtue ethicist or whatever, I think what all three positions generally agree upon, that is the ultimate moral obligation, is to pursue what is good and to avoid what is evil.
That's Aquinas. That's one of Aquinas' formulations of the basic rules. Now Brian's going to smile here. So this is formulation of the basic rules of natural law. Yeah, that's there. Do good and avoid evil.
Yeah. So, I mean, now obviously deontologists, utilitarians, virtue ethics, they can all debate over each other what exactly pursuing the good and avoiding evil means. But I think they would all pretty much hold to that as a principle.
Yeah, I don't think that's why it's a decent principle, but it's not the one I would want to get in there at the level that's going to. It's too open-ended about what it requires. I want at least with respect to applying to God. I wanted these things that they're going to be really clear about what the requirement is. For example, don't permit horrendous evil for the sake of providing a good, which you could easily provide without permitting that horrendous evil. That is not like just do good and avoid evil. That's a clear thing. We could see it has how that's going to apply. Do good and avoid evil is too amorphous about how we're going to work that out. I want something that really has clear application for us and for God.
Yeah.
And there are a few things like that.
I point that out because that's sort of like a thing, because I know there is a lot of debate when it comes to like the three main fields. And I was saying that's sort of a basic, level. Like if you were wanting to get the most broad understanding that all three like major fields could agree upon, it would probably be something along those lines.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, there's a big problem for this when you teach ethics. You're trying to, you want the students to come away with an objective ethics. I mean, that's what I want. And so, well, actually, I have an interesting little textbook that kind of, there's three challenges to an objective ethics that you have to deal with. If any of these challenges work, objective ethics is out the door. And one is what I would call a challenge from religion, that it's all based on God's commands. And then you don't have an objective ethics to consult. You have to look at what God's commands are. Or the other, it's relative. It's based on society's practices. Well, then you look at sociology. What is the society practicing? And then you'll know what's right. And the third thing is it's based on well, you can't support morality over egoism. So you can't really say there's an objective ethics because egoism is equally rational. So you have to, if you're trying to establish an objective ethics, you got to knock down each one of those three things. Then you get to the isms, Kantianism, utilitarianism, and Aristotelianism. And now there's still a problem here. They're going to pull us in seemingly different directions. So then what do? Well, what I do is to try to find the best interpretation of them, which pull them back together as something common. And one of the nicest things I like to use is what I call is a kind of the odd implies can principle. It's kind of a developed form of that. It says that the moral requirements can't impose unreasonable sacrifices on people, unreasonable sacrifices. And that's going to hold under utilitarian ethics, under Kantian ethics, and Aristotelian ethics. And that's going to help to draw them all three to the same practical requirements. And then you can move on to practical topics. Design of an introduction ethics course. But you've got to get over, unless you're going to just defend subjectivism, I don't believe subjectivism. I believe this objective ethics can be founded. And I'm trying to find easy ways to do that, to convince people of it. And I think it could be done. And then I was doing fine with that. And I came up with positions that some of them about gay rights and stuff were opposed to traditional Catholic views. But I was in a philosophy department that said, you pursue reason alone. So you can do that. Reason alone tells you this. And maybe, and I think in some sense, the Catholic views need to be revised on that because of that. Because if reason tells you this is okay, there's not going to be a norm coming from theology that says it's wrong. Because again, the Catholic view, faith and reason don't conflict. So if reason really requires these things, theology can't go against.
Yeah.
I like that. There's Protestant views that don't go that way. They say, yeah, theology pulls you against reason. That's it. Forget it. That's it. You go. But I like the Catholicism has always been kind of an interesting, nice background for my working in moral theory, because they believe that these things don't conflict.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, so how are you doing currently? I know me and Jim have been talking a little bit over you, Brian. What do you got to say?
Oh, I guess I was just wondering, going back a little bit, not to beat a dead horse, whatever, but if your views of that moral axioms and that 2 + 2 = 4 and all that, if those are not abstract objects, but are abstraction from actual existing things, would that change your view?
Well, I think we can learn them from looking at concrete things.
Okay.
But then what we see is the concrete thing is the way of eliciting this abstract. We come to the abstract relationship. The kid got counting on their fingers. I mean, he's got to, yeah, and so but the concrete world is a way of letting us into this world that it is a world of abstract relations. And abstract normative relations, some of it, and then we can come to know that, and then we can then apply it in new situations. I mean, that's always what we're always coming across is new situations, especially when we move cross culturally, and we then trying to figure out whether is there noise. I wrote this paper. I've gone to China not this past summer, but last 2 summers before that. I was actually in Wuhan for 2017, which when it doesn't have its fame that it has now. It had 17 million people in there, or 11 million people.
Wow.
Even, it's a big city. And so I was trying to understand, is there, can we come up with an international ethics for China and the US, and that we should be agreeing to this international ethics, and then we should apply it to the problems in both US relations and also in internal problems. And I wanted to try to find, is there a way to do that? And another way to look at that too is to look at problems, their concrete problems, and why they seem to move in different directions. For example, how treatment of women, how that works in China. And also this trade war that we were having initially with Trump. What's the morality behind that? What should happen? Is there a moral requirement here that say, well, we should go with more what China wants, or what the US wants, or is it just a political fight and there's no morality to it at all? I would like to be a morality to it that would lead to a resolution. And I wanted it to be also the case for gender relations and for all sorts of other things. And then we find this common morality that we apply. But we'd have to go, one of the things is going to the culture and seeing the different practices and trying to understand them will either do one of 2 things. Either it will let you see, well, they're wrong for doing this because of these general norms, or I got a misunderstanding of the general norms because they taught me something that I didn't see before. And that's great. That's be another way of knowing whether you've got the general norms right or not. It's just like knowing whether your strategy for building bridges is good or not. You go and look in Japan and see how they build them there. And maybe they got something different. You didn't even know that you've been building bridges in the US for the last 20 years. You never saw they build them in Japan. And they do something different. Well, now you got a new theory for building bridges that you didn't have before. It's fun. Morality's always been it's a consequentialist game, and a lot of things counts on it, but it's been a real intellectual adventure to kind of think through moral problems across culturally and tested ones, and try to see if you can come up with resolutions. That's been my life.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, I believe we've been going on for about, I think, an hour and a half so far. I did have some questions that I received on Twitter that I would like to ask both of you. That I got from the fans. So, let's see. Oh yeah, I remember. For this question would go for Jim. You know, since you talk a lot about theodicies and how they that people go about things, and how theists try to save God from, in the problem of evil. What would you say is so far like the best theodicy you've heard of?
Swinburne's.
Mm.
Richard Swinburne is done more to come up with defensible theodicy than anybody in a modern period. Pontic has a lot of credit for what he's done on the issues, and he has done some interesting things early on. Although my view now goes contrary to what Pontic is, and actually it's going to be contrary to what Swinburne holds too. But Swinburne has really tried to think through as a philosopher a whole range of normative metaphysical issues related to philosophy of religion and problem of evil. It's a wonderful set of achievements. Nobody, I think, is close to him on that. And Pontic is not writing now, so Swinburne is still going, and who knows what's going to come next?
Yeah. Now this next question will be going to Brian. So, we talked about the Bible in here. Now, obviously, there is some commands that God gives in the Bible that seem to make him seem, what's the word? Just bad. Like, for example, the Canaanite, the order to utterly destroy the Canaanites and stuff like that. What would you say about that? Would you say that does sort of pose a problem with God being good in many senses, Brian?
If you hold that God has to maintain a standard of goodness outside of himself, it possibly could. But if you don't, and most Christians, even if they think that God is a moral being, don't see the Canaanite genocide, or whatever, well, I won't call it genocides, as bad. The reason I want to call it genocide is because genocide itself has a moral connotation, like murder. So God can't murder someone, like a lion can't murder a human being. God can't murder a human because God is the creator and sustainer and the sovereign over all life. So if he wants to take someone's life as a creator, he can do that, and there's no moral problem with it. With the Canaanites in particular, God, the text says that God had allowed them basically to sin to a certain extent, and they rejected God along the way, and God used Israel as the instrument of their judgment. And so, as the creator and sustainer of all things that exist, God didn't need Israel. He could have just done that and they would have all ceased to exist or died. But God wanted to use Israel. And since he's sovereign over all creation, he can do that because he's God. That would be, and whether you regard God as a moral being or not, Christians by and large don't see this as a moral problem. Just have the problem to be answered. But I would think that there's not a moral problem because God is sovereign over our life and can use Israel as an instrument to carry out his judgment if he wants to.
All right.
Could I add something on that a little bit? So,
sure.
But could God give the command that the Canaanites be tortured? Suppose the Canaanites actually were pretty good people. The Israelites just coming in, they want their land. This is it. This is a land grab, and they were pretty good people. They were settling there, and so what happens is God was going to support his people. So could he come in and say, okay, kill those Canaanites, men, women, children, and torture them to death as you kill them? Is that God got a right to do that?
I don't think that we would say God would do that because it's not. So killing somebody is an act of judgment. We've never seen anywhere where saying torture, even in our own, well, I guess some would use torture today as an act of judgment or some kind of tool. but we never see God using torture as an instrument of justice or judgment, because he's not killing them just because he takes pleasure in seeing them die. It's because he let their level of sin rise to such an extent that at this point God's going to cut them off. So it's not just for the sake of it in and of itself.
But then he's got it seems like it's a moral constraint on this then. He can punish them for their sin, and maybe he can take their land away to give it to his people. But he can't torture them and make them suffer, given if they were innocent people, while he's taking the land away. I mean,
I think this goes back to the distinction
what he can't do.
Right, the absolute versus suppositional distinction that we made. So if God is going to create humans, he's going to create humans to act in a certain way. Now, just going out and murdering people for the sake of murdering would be wrong. But if God exists as a sovereign creator, he can exercise his justice through someone else, and that would be, if you want to say, justified through the use of that people. But torturing is different than seen as a distilling as carrying out an act of judgment. One person torturing somebody else would just be as a matter of principle, just something that would be going against that person's nature, where killing is not. It'd be
What
like
about God
capital punishment.
What about God doing it? He doesn't
God
actually
doing the
use the
torturing?
Israelites. Imagine he doesn't use the Israelites. He just strikes down the Canaanites himself, and he tortures them as he strikes them down. Is that okay?
So tortures them in the sense they're just in immense pain.
Yeah, it's,
I mean, we could probably see that in the flood. I mean, people probably had, people probably had horrific deaths, for example, in the flood. I don't see how.
Imagine no flood here. No, I mean, he just makes them suffer as he's killing them himself to provide room for his people.
Well, see, the distinction you're making now is it's not judgment. It's just because he wants to get rid of them.
And he's going to make them suffer somehow because maybe he wants that.
Even just getting away from the suffering part and saying, well, God's just going to kill them just because he wants to kill them.
Well, maybe he's killing them to remove them for his people, but in the process he's going to do it for men, women, and children. But he's going to make them suffer. That's just something he puts in there. And it seems like what you're saying, he can't put that in there. That's kind of a moral constraint on what he can do.
Yeah, like I said, that God can't command one person to torture babies, like we said before, because the act of torture in and of itself. What?
This is God doing it, not commanding anybody to do it. God doing it himself on these creatures.
Right, but because the reason he committed. I don't want to use the word genocide because that has, again, the idea of moral action itself. But the reason he used Israel to take out and kill the Canaanites was an act of judgment. So you're trying to say, can God just kill somebody for no reason whatsoever?
Well, I mean, look, it's unclear about the judgment thing there at all. But yeah, if there's some constraints, it sounds like when we go back to Job, I mean, all that Job suffered there, his children killed his.
Right. That's what I was about to say.
I mean, that's there was no judgment there.
That's right.
Yeah, and
that's right.
And seemingly to win a bet with the demon or whatever.
Right.
A little not a great act overall.
And that's what I was going to point out, as you said, is that God did allow Satan to inflict. Kill Job's family, servants, cattle, and everything else, and inflict disease on Job.
Yeah.
And so I don't see. Well, first of all, God said, they're trying to compare the Canaanite torture with Job in a sense. There would be no way to judge God on that, I don't think, because there's just no standard to say God is supposed to act a certain way. And that God, there's some kind of moral abstract axioms that God has to uphold. Mm-hmm. But we just simply don't really see God saying, hey, go just kill these people just for no reason. Even when we see the flood and that kind of thing. Now, Job's example, I think, is an interesting one because it is say it's without cause. But because God is a sovereign creator, I don't think we set the moral component to it.
Yeah, I mean, another question, this sort of goes for both of you, but I'm gonna have, obviously I'll have Jim go first on it. It's, I know that Jim has actually written, a rebuttal to Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. I was wondering because obviously free will is a big thing when you're doing any sort of problem of evil, or when you're doing, just basically even in ethics in general, where free will is a general big part. I was wondering, how does free will really work in both of your ethical systems? How big of a factor it is? You take sort of a libertarian, compatibilist, what kind of view?
Well, I really like to be a compatibilist, but most people defending God here want to be incompatible. So my argument works for compatibilism or incompatibilism. So I don't take a stand on that for purposes of the argument I'm raising for the theist. But the issue, this is where being a political philosopher was so helpful to me. The issue about free will or freedom here is when you think about issues where evil is done, horrendous evil is done, there is a freedom. There's the perpetrator's got a lot of freedom when he does the evil deed. But then what's happening is the victim is losing freedom. So all these horrendous evil situations, there's freedom on one side and freedom destroyed on the other side. So it's not any issue of maximizing freedom here that's going on. What if you don't have any control on the evil? And what we do when we set up political states is to try to put a control on that evil. We try to with police forces and deterrence of all sorts, and maybe if we had a really good force that could anticipate when murder is about to be done, we would implement it if we could be done fairly. And so what we're trying to do is we're going to limit the freedom of the perpetrators to some degree, and in order to bring up to allow for the freedom of would-be victims. They won't be victims anymore and losing freedom. They'll have their freedoms. So there'll be a just distribution of freedom. So when you talk about the free will defense, are you really interested in giving a just distribution of freedom? Or are you just interested in perpetrators having as much freedom as they can get for themselves? That's not a great idea of having perpetrators just uncontrolled. We want perpetrators controlled so that victims have more freedom. We do that with states, and it seems to me that God could have a role in this as a preventer of last resort. When states and individuals don't prevent horrendous evils, God could come in and prevent them and sort of save the victim and save the victim's freedom, which is a lot more important in that situation than the perpetrator having an extra amount of freedom that he really doesn't deserve.
Yeah, I definitely think, because often there is a sort of implies a can, or they like the possibility of alternate possibilities, where, there's a common rebuttal to that, where it's sort of the Frankfurt sort of examples where
Frankfurt wants to say that you can be free, and even though you can't act otherwise. My partner and I, many years ago, wrote a paper that nobody pays much attention to, which tried to show that there was a way of showing that even Frankfurt's cases, there's a sense in which where you're free, there's a sense in which you could act otherwise. It was a way of conceptualizing it. So I think it's true is that wherever there's freedom, there is it has to be the capability of acting otherwise. Otherwise, we're not talking about moral freedom. And Frankfurt's examples make us think that that's not true, but there's another way to restate them and show that it is true. And so even for his cases, where we're going to say there's freedom, there is the capability of acting otherwise. I think that ought implies can is a very basic principle of morality. And that's where I mentioned earlier, I want to expand on that principle. Usually it's meant to require logical possibility, physical possibility, psychological possibility. That's sort of where it sort of stops in the tradition. And I think there's another sense of moral possibility here, that things that are morally unreasonable to impose on people are morally impossible. And those things should not be done. And so because they violate this more extended notion of the Oedipus principle that says don't impose unreasonable sacrifices on people.
Yeah.
So Oedipus can, in its traditional sense, or in this extended sense, I think is a very important principle for morality. And it does apply capability of doing otherwise.
In order, just so people, because obviously not everyone is a nerd when it comes to philosophy and knows these things, like the Frankfurt example, just to give a sort of a basic, just sort of restatement, where let's imagine you're going into a voting booth and you have this, this evil dictator has put like this robot or something inside your brain. And when you go into the voting booth, you have two options where you could either vote for the evil dictator or you could vote for this like benevolent figure. So you get a sort of vote on both of them. But here's the thing is where the Frankfurt sort of case would be that, like, if you wanted to vote for the benevolent one, the evil dictator would flip a switch or something, and it would automatically make you vote for him. Whereas, but if you did vote for him, and you didn't go for the benevolent leader beforehand, well, he would just do nothing. So in a sense, the Frankfurt example says, well, you couldn't have done otherwise, in the sense you couldn't have not voted for the benevolent dictator if you had just, if you had voted for him, intentionally, there would still be a sort of saying you were immoral, even if, you really couldn't have done otherwise.
I hadn't thought this was going to come up as a topic. This paper that my partner and I wrote about 20 years ago, we had a solution to show that even for this case, if you're going to say the person freely does what they're doing, there has to be some sense in which the person could have acted otherwise. And there's a way to, even with the way Frankfurt has set it up, you can show that the person, there still could be a sense the person could have acted otherwise, or if there isn't a sense that the person could act otherwise, you want to withdraw the claim that it was a free act. Now, I don't remember exactly how we did this, but I will send you the paper if you want, and you can look it over. But there's the Frankfurt thing, I think, doesn't rule out the requirement that moral freedom requires the ability to act otherwise.
All right. Well, I mean, I brought it up more because free will tends to be a very popular thing when you're going into ethics, because it goes into moral responsibility and the like.
Yeah. Well,
so
why I phrased it, remember, was I talked about these competing freedoms, the freedom of the perpetrator and the freedom of the victim. And if you're going to say, well, look, God's permission of evil is justified for the free will. Well, there's the free will of the victim and there's the free will of the perpetrator. And if you just don't, if you say, well, let powers take the result here, the perpetrator is going to trounce the victim, and their free will is going to be trounced. And that seems to be a bad result from the sake of freedom. So if the whole justification for God permitting evil is for the sake of freedom, you got to be weighing the freedom perpetrators against the freedom of victims. That's my point. And it doesn't really get into this Frankfurt stuff because we're assuming, we're talking about imposing on people or not imposing on people, that kind of freedom. We're not kind of getting into the inner situation. Although the Frankfurt thing did this idea of a demon coming in and changing the situation. But anyway, I think the thing is better cashed out in terms of the political state and how in the political state we're trying to maximize, get a good distribution of freedom by limiting the freedom of would-be perpetrators.
All right.
I should be doing that too.
Yeah. So I'm glad we got that on your side. What would you say, Brian?
Well, I certainly want a hot dog for one thing, all this Frankfurt talk, but I'm a compatibilist in the bottom line. So that means, for my view, that God can will that John wills X. So God is willing John to will X, and there's no contradiction there. That's the bottom line. Yeah.
So you wouldn't be sort of in the libertarian camp.
No, not where I am right now. I'd be more of a if God wants person whoever to do X, the person's going to will and want to do X because God is willing on him to do that. Mm-hmm. It really boils down to our view of philosophy of human nature and our view of God's sovereignty and providence. I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, I think I like the compatibilist view too. But the problem, as I see it, is a lot of these theists think that compatibilism gets them in more trouble with God and evil, and so that's why they went for the incompatibilist view. And so I don't want my argument against theism, if it works, it can't work if it's just going to depend on compatibilism being better than incompatibilism. That's a hard thing to fight and show that your view is the better view. So what I just do is, well, let's run it with I'll run it with compatibilism, run it with incompatibilism, and then see where the chips lay. The other thing is, look, I haven't been in this game that long, as I sort of indicated, this game about the problem of evil. My commitment to atheism is just as strong as this argument. Someone, if I don't think this argument fails, but if my argument fails, if somebody shows it fails, then I'm no longer an atheist. I have a long religious tradition. I don't have any. I like, in some sense, the tradition to be true here. But my investigation here, starting with the Templeton grant, has led me in this direction and led me to this argument. And I'm going to run with this argument until I see somebody knocking it down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's really all the questions that I really was able to get up upon. I actually did like how you both responded when it came to it. Yeah, I believe we've been going on for about, I think, maybe hour and a half or so more. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what I got for the questions from other people. So I don't know what we want to do, if you guys want to continue this talk, or do you want to sort of end it here? Maybe we can schedule something in the future on maybe some other topic if possible.
I probably didn't end it here, but I want to say thank you both for being here and doing this. Jim, I always enjoy working with you. I want to recommend your book to everyone out there, theist or atheist. Is a good God logically possible? If you want to be up on the problem of evil, then you need to read that book. But I appreciate, Jim, you always being such a great person to work with and to be able to talk to. And Derek, thanks for having us on. I appreciate it. And it's been a lot of fun. Hope we do it again.
Yeah, I'm very appreciative for Brian and for you, Vic, too, also for getting us, or Derek, to get us into this. Because I really want to discuss these issues as much as I can to check out the arguments and learning. I'm constantly learning on this topic, even after the book. Brian is involved with there's a special issue of Journal Religions, and there's 16 people that have contributed to that, and they're all mostly all theists on this. And so I've been looking at their papers and trying to understand things and of how they're coming at things. And my view since the book has changed in certain ways. I think I've moves that I didn't have before, that people were by raising objections, making me see. Now, maybe someone's going to raise some objection that's going to do it in. I don't know. But the fact it's moving. It's a moving target. It wasn't set. I wish I could write that book over. And that book itself was a product of an earlier book, that earlier manuscript, and that was not as good as what the book was. And so it's a growing project, and we learn this stuff together. We can't do this stuff alone. No way we can do this alone. And so I'm really glad that Brian has opened up on this and invited me to do different things. Actually invited me to do this too, because it is a way of trying to learn more about it and test things out and see what people say. Am I going to get a recording of this? Because I want to listen to this afterwards, because I think there were points in it that I wanted to, mull over, but now they're going to be lost to my memory for this hour and a half. I really would like to see a recording to kind of really go back to them and see whether maybe I don't agree with what I said there. Really, maybe I overstated things, and maybe Brian raised some point I didn't realize, and I'll see it afterwards. Yeah.
I definitely, Brian could definitely show you the video later on, because I know he has much better contact information with you.
Yes.
And, I also recommend, if, obviously I recommend people read your book. And if theists want to be challenged more, I would also recommend, other atheist philosophers like Graham Oppy, like I mentioned before, Alex Rosenberg, you can get J.L. Schellenberg. There are a lot of atheist philosophers that have, especially 100%, like if you're a theist worth your salt, you have to read J.L. Mackie.
Could I make one last point here, that there is something unique going on with my book. Most atheist philosophers today are basically making their argument against God on probability. Mm-hmm. They think God is improbable. And actually, the theists on the other side are going to some say God is probable. So it's an argument about probability. After Mackie actually had a logical argument against God, but it failed. And ever after that, the theists have come up with doing probability arguments. My argument is distinctive in that it tries to go back to Mackie and have a logical argument using logically necessary moral principles to make the argument. In that sense, it's somewhat unique. And if it might even think that if it worked, it would be a better argument than the probability arguments.
Yeah, because with probability arguments, you always have to run sort of the risk of more background information. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say your position is unique too. I mean, the only other atheist philosopher that I know that tries to go back to a more logical and non-probabilistic would probably be Graham Oppy. I know I've read some of his work, and he seems to. I mean, I think he personally does buy the probability more, but he does, he does go more into detail on the more logical, and he brings that up. So he's more of the sort of
one of my heroes. He is one of my heroes, and
he's sort of a take no prisoners sort of guy. He'll give you both.
Yeah, he's actually he endorsed my book on the back. Look at the back cover. He is one of my heroes, and I know quite a bit of his work, but I don't know all of it, and I don't know. Maybe you're right. He's got a logical argument going there. But he does some really fascinating work. He's a great contributor to the defense of atheism.
So, I definitely recommend, if you're a theist or atheist, it's definitely works great to hear the best of the best on both sides of this issue.
Definitely.
So, obviously recommend, like, if you want to hear the theist response, go to Swinburne. That would be one of the the better ones. You can also, if you want to hear more about, Brian's take on it, you can obviously go to his site, which is obviously www.brianhuffling.com. And, you can simply go to him as well. And I'm sure Brian has a whole pages and links of philosophers that have also gone on it. And that can, better help theists and atheists wrap their minds around the problem of evil.
It's a problem to wrap your mind around for sure.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, that's really all I have to say. It was nice talking to you both.
Same
Yeah,
here.
thank you for having us on. I appreciate it.
Yes, definitely.
Mhm.